On a humid August night in 1971, Kansas City went dark. What should have been a routine power grid maintenance turned into the perfect cover for one of the most sophisticated heists in American history. While the city sat in darkness, $2.1 million in cash vanished from the Federal Reserve Bank's underground vault. No alarms sounded, no guards were harmed, and no traces were left behind. The money simply disappeared into the night, along with any hope of finding the culprits. For 53 years, this case has remained one of the FBI's most frustrating unsolved mysteries. The investigation went cold within months. The suspects evaporated like smoke, and the stolen currency never surfaced in circulation. Federal agents called it a perfect crime, executed with surgical precision by individuals who seemed to know exactly when the city would be vulnerable and how long they had to work. But in early 2024, during the demolition of a long-abandoned warehouse in Kansas City's industrial district, construction workers discovered something that would crack open this decades-old case. Hidden inside a fireproof safe, wedged behind crumbling concrete, was a single burnt Polaroid photograph. The image was barely recognizable, its edges charred and its surface stained with age. Yet what remained visible was enough to identify a face that had never appeared in any FBI file. A man who had been hiding in plain sight for over 5 decades. Before we dive deeper into this incredible discovery, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The photograph would lead investigators to uncover a web of deception that stretched back to the night of the blackout, revealing not just who orchestrated the heist, but how they had managed to stay invisible for so long. What began as a routine demolition job was about to expose the truth behind one of the most meticulously planned robberies in federal history. August 14, 1971, was supposed to be an ordinary Friday night in Kansas City. The summer heat had settled over the metropolitan area like a heavy blanket, and most residents were looking forward to the weekend. The Kansas City Power and Light Company had scheduled routine maintenance on the primary electrical grid, work that would require brief, rolling blackouts across different sectors of the city. These outages were common during peak summer months, necessary to prevent overloading and maintain system stability. The Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, a fortress-like structure in the heart of the downtown financial district, had been notified of the planned maintenance weeks in advance. Built in 1921, the building housed one of the most secure vaults in the Midwest, containing millions of dollars in currency awaiting distribution to banks across the region. The vault itself was a marvel of early 20th century engineering, with steel walls 18 inches thick and a time-locked door that could only be opened during specific hours. At 9:47 p.m., the lights went out across the downtown Kansas City. The planned blackout was scheduled to last exactly 45 minutes, long enough for technicians to complete their work on the transformer station 6 blocks away. Emergency generators kicked in at hospitals and critical facilities, but the Federal Reserve Bank, like most commercial buildings, was plunged into darkness. Only the building's minimal security lighting remained active, powered by a backup system designed to last several hours. Inside the bank, 3 security guards maintained their posts. The evening shift was considered routine, with the vault sealed and the building's perimeter secured. These weren't armored car guards or federal agents, but private security employees who had been working the same shifts for years. They knew the building's layout intimately, understood the protocols, and had never experienced anything more threatening than a false alarm from the motion sensors. What none of them knew was that this particular blackout had been anticipated by someone else entirely. Someone who had been watching, planning, and waiting for exactly this moment. The vault at the Federal Reserve Bank contained more than just currency. On the night of August 14th, it housed approximately $2.1 million in fresh bills that had arrived from Washington, D.C. earlier that week. These weren't random denominations, but crisp, sequential 20s, 50s, and 100s, intended for circulation through regional banks. The money was organized in sealed canvas bags, each containing a specific amount and marked with federal tracking numbers. The security system protecting this fortune was considered state-of-the-art for 1971. Motion detectors covered every corridor, pressure plates lay hidden beneath the marble floors, and infrared sensors monitored the vault area. But all of these systems shared one critical vulnerability. They required constant electrical power to function. The backup generators that kept the emergency lighting operational were not connected to the sophisticated alarm network, a cost-saving measure that seemed reasonable at the time. During the planned blackout, the building's security system would be temporarily disabled. The vault's time lock would continue to function on its internal mechanism, but the electronic surveillance that protected the corridors and entrance points would go dark. For exactly 45 minutes, the Federal Reserve Bank would be operating on 1920s security protocols in a 1970s world. At 10:15 p.m., 18 minutes after the power failed, a service van pulled up to the loading dock at the rear of the Federal Reserve Building. The vehicle bore the markings of Midwest Electrical Services, a legitimate contractor that had performed work for the bank in the past. Two men in coveralls emerged from the van, carrying toolboxes and wearing hard hats. They approached the service entrance with the confidence of workers who belonged there. The loading dock was equipped with a manual lock, a heavy steel mechanism that required a specific key. The guards had been told to expect possible visits from utility workers during the blackout, technicians who might need access to check electrical connections or emergency systems. When the men knocked on the service door, identifying themselves as electrical contractors, the guard on duty didn't hesitate to let them in. What happened next would take exactly 27 minutes to complete. The two men moved through the darkened corridors with flashlights, but they weren't heading toward any electrical panels or utility rooms. Instead, they navigated directly to the vault level, descending the marble staircase with the precision of individuals who had walked this route before. The vault door itself remained sealed, its time lock preventing access until the following morning. But the men weren't interested in the vault. They were focused on a much more accessible target, the temporary holding area where incoming currency was stored before being transferred to the main vault. This room, located adjacent to the vault, was secured with a conventional lock and monitored by the same electronic systems that were currently offline. Using tools that appeared to be standard electrical equipment, the men forced the lock on the holding room door. Inside, they found exactly what they were looking for: 12 canvas bags containing the $2.1 million in fresh currency that had arrived from Washington. The bags were heavy, each weighing approximately 40 pounds, but the men had come prepared with a wheeled cart disguised as electrical testing equipment. The loading process was methodical and quiet. Each bag was checked for identifying marks, and the men seemed to know exactly which ones to take and which to leave behind. They avoided bags containing coins, securities, or documents, focusing exclusively on the high-denomination bills that would be hardest to trace once they entered circulation. By 10:42 p.m., the service van was loaded and ready to depart. The men had replaced the broken lock with an identical one, wiped down surfaces they had touched, and left no obvious signs of their presence. They exited through the same service door they had entered, thanking the guard for his cooperation and explaining that they had successfully completed their inspection of the building's electrical systems. At 10:47 p.m., exactly 45 minutes after the blackout began, the lights of Kansas City flickered back to life. The Federal Reserve Bank's security systems resumed operation. Motion detectors swept the corridors, and the infrared sensors began monitoring the vault area. Everything appeared normal. The guards completed their hourly rounds, checked the perimeter, and settled in for the remainder of their shift. It wasn't until 7:30 a.m. the following morning that the theft was discovered. When the vault's time lock disengaged and bank officials entered the temporary holding area, they found empty spaces where 12 bags of currency should have been. The substitute lock appeared undamaged, and there were no signs of forced entry. The security logs showed no unusual activity during the night, and the guards reported only routine contact with electrical contractors. The FBI was called immediately. Within hours, a team of federal agents descended on the Federal Reserve Bank, treating the scene as a major federal crime. The investigation would consume thousands of hours, involve dozens of agents, and extend across multiple states. Yet despite the massive effort, the case would produce virtually no leads, no suspects, and no recovery of the stolen money. The power company confirmed that the blackout had been planned and executed exactly as scheduled. Midwest Electrical Services verified that they had not dispatched any crews to the Federal Reserve Bank that night. The service van had been stolen from a contractor's lot 3 days earlier and was found abandoned in a parking garage 12 miles away, stripped of any identifying evidence. The 3 security guards were questioned extensively, their backgrounds investigated, and their financial records scrutinized. All 3 passed polygraph tests, and none showed any signs of sudden wealth or suspicious behavior. The guard who had admitted the men was devastated by the breach, but investigators concluded that he had followed reasonable protocols given the circumstances. The stolen currency posed a unique challenge for federal agents. Unlike jewelry, art, or other valuable items that could be traced through sales or recovery, cash was designed to be anonymous once it entered circulation. The sequential serial numbers were logged with the Treasury Department, but monitoring every $20, $50, and $100 bill in the American economy was impossible with 1971 technology. Within 6 months, the investigation had stalled. The FBI had interviewed hundreds of potential suspects, from known bank robbers to electrical contractors with access to utility information. They had analyzed the timing of the blackout, studied the building's security protocols, and examined every detail of the crime scene. Yet the perpetrators remained as invisible as they had been on the night of the theft. The case was officially classified as inactive in 1974, though it remained open in federal records. Insurance companies had paid out claims totaling $2.1 million, and the Federal Reserve Bank had upgraded its security systems to prevent similar incidents. The stolen money was presumed to be in circulation, its serial numbers diluted among millions of other bills flowing through the American economy. For decades, the Kansas City blackout heist would be studied in law enforcement academies as an example of perfect timing and preparation. The criminals had exploited a narrow window of vulnerability, executed their plan with military precision, and vanished without leaving a trace. It was the kind of crime that investigators both respected and despised, a demonstration of criminal intelligence that had outmaneuvered the federal government's best efforts. But perfect crimes, as investigators would learn 53 years later, sometimes leave behind imperfect evidence. And sometimes that evidence waits patiently in the darkness, preserved by chance and revealed by circumstance, ready to tell a story that everyone assumed would never be told. The warehouse at 1247 Industrial Boulevard had been empty for almost 2 decades when the demolition crew arrived in March 2024. The building, a squat concrete structure with boarded windows and a collapsing roof, had once housed a small electronics repair business that closed in the early 2000s. Since then, it had changed hands multiple times, serving briefly as storage for various failed ventures before being abandoned entirely. The city had condemned the property as part of an urban renewal project, and the demolition was routine work for Kansas City Construction Services. The crew expected to find the usual debris of a forgotten business, old equipment, scattered paperwork, and the accumulated decay of neglect. What they didn't expect to find was a fireproof safe embedded in the concrete floor of what had once been the building's office. The safe was discovered on the 3rd day of demolition, when heavy machinery broke through the floor and exposed a metal corner jutting from the concrete. It took several hours to excavate the entire unit, a commercial-grade fireproof safe that weighed nearly 800 pounds. The combination lock was corroded beyond use, and the exterior showed signs of deliberate damage, as if someone had tried unsuccessfully to break it open decades earlier. When the safe was finally opened using cutting tools, the contents were minimal but intriguing. Inside were several items that seemed to have survived whatever fire or disaster had damaged the safe's exterior. There were charred documents, their text mostly illegible, a melted plastic bag containing what appeared to be jewelry, and wedged in the back corner, a single Polaroid photograph. The photograph was in terrible condition. Its edges were burned, the surface was stained and warped, and much of the image was obscured by smoke damage. But enough remained visible to show a man in his 30s, wearing what appeared to be a work uniform, standing next to some kind of electrical equipment. On the back of the photograph, written in fading ink, were the words KC Power, AUG 71, and a set of initials that were barely legible. The demolition foreman, recognizing that the date coincided with a significant event in Kansas City history, contacted the police. The photograph was turned over to the Kansas City Police Department, which forwarded it to the FBI field office. Within days, the faded Polaroid was being examined by federal agents who specialized in cold cases. The timing was impossible to ignore. August 1971 was the month of the Federal Reserve Bank heist, and the reference to KC Power suggested a connection to the electrical blackout that had provided cover for the theft. The photograph appeared to show someone with access to the power company's equipment, someone who might have had inside knowledge of the planned maintenance that created the perfect opportunity for the robbery. Using advanced digital enhancement techniques that hadn't existed in 1971, FBI forensic specialists began working to recover as much detail as possible from the damaged photograph. They adjusted contrast, sharpened edges, and used computer algorithms to fill in missing pixels. Slowly, the face in the photograph became clearer, revealing features that could be compared against databases and archived records. The breakthrough came when investigators cross-referenced the enhanced image with employment records from Kansas City Power and Light Company. The man in the photograph was identified as Thomas Mitchell, an electrical technician who had worked for the power company from 1969 to 1972. Mitchell had been part of the crew responsible for the grid maintenance that caused the blackout on August 14, 1971. What made this identification particularly significant was that Thomas Mitchell had never appeared in any FBI file related to the Federal Reserve Bank heist. During the original investigation, agents had questioned dozens of power company employees, but Mitchell's name had somehow been overlooked. He had been just another technician among many, someone whose background hadn't raised any red flags at the time. Further investigation revealed why Mitchell had remained invisible to federal agents. He had been employed by the power company for less than 3 years, making him a relatively new hire, who wouldn't have been considered a priority for questioning. His personnel file showed no criminal history, no financial problems, and no associations with known criminals. He had been the perfect inside man because he had appeared to be perfectly ordinary. But the discovery of the photograph suggested that Mitchell's role in the heist had been much more significant than anyone had realized. The fact that the image was dated August 1971 and showed him with electrical equipment indicated that he had documented his involvement in the crime, perhaps as a form of insurance or leverage with his criminal partners. The investigation into Thomas Mitchell's background revealed a man who had lived a remarkably unremarkable life. Born in 1941 in a small town outside Kansas City, he had served briefly in the Army before returning to civilian life and finding work with the power company. He had married in 1970, purchased a modest home in a middle-class neighborhood, and by all appearances had been living the American dream. Yet the financial records told a different story. In the months following the August 1971 blackout, Mitchell had made several significant purchases that seemed inconsistent with his salary as an electrical technician. He had paid off his mortgage, bought a new car, and made substantial improvements to his home. When questioned by his neighbors about his sudden prosperity, Mitchell had explained that he had received an inheritance from a distant relative. The inheritance story had been plausible enough at the time, but investigators in 2024 found no evidence that any such inheritance had ever existed. Mitchell's family members, when contacted, had no knowledge of any wealthy relatives who might have left him money. The sudden influx of cash appeared to have come from an unknown source, and the timing coincided perfectly with the Federal Reserve Bank robbery. Mitchell's employment records showed that he had resigned from Kansas City Power and Light in early 1972, citing health problems. He had relocated to Arizona, where he had purchased a small ranch and lived quietly until his death in 1998. During his years in Arizona, he had maintained a low profile, avoided any criminal activity, and had never been questioned by law enforcement about any matter. The discovery of the photograph raised immediate questions about how it had ended up in the abandoned warehouse. Property records showed that the building had been purchased in 1972 by a company called Southwest Electronics, which had operated a repair business there for nearly 30 years. The company had been owned by a man named Robert Chen, who had emigrated from Taiwan in the late 1960s and established himself as a skilled electronics technician. Chen had died in 2003, and his business had closed shortly afterward. His family had sold the building to a series of investors who had been unable to find successful tenants for the space. The safe had apparently been left behind when the business closed, its contents forgotten and its existence unknown to subsequent owners. Investigators theorized that the safe had belonged to Chen's electronics business, but they couldn't immediately explain how a photograph of Thomas Mitchell had ended up inside it. The connection between Chen and Mitchell was not obvious from the available records, and Chen's family members claimed no knowledge of the photograph or its significance. The breakthrough came when investigators examined Chen's immigration records and discovered that he had entered the United States in 1968 with skills in electronics and electrical systems. Further investigation revealed that Chen had briefly worked as a contractor for Kansas City Power and Light Company in 1971, performing specialized repairs on electronic equipment. His work had brought him into contact with power company employees, including Thomas Mitchell. The relationship between Chen and Mitchell appeared to have been professional at first, but investigators suspected that it had evolved into something more. Chen's electronics expertise would have been valuable to anyone planning a sophisticated heist, particularly one that required precise timing and knowledge of electrical systems. Mitchell's inside access to the power company's maintenance schedules would have complemented Chen's technical skills perfectly. The photograph itself suggested that Chen had been documenting the conspiracy, perhaps as a form of protection or leverage. The fact that it had survived in his safe for over 50 years indicated that he had considered it important enough to preserve, even as he had maintained his legitimate business and avoided any criminal activity. By 2024, both Mitchell and Chen were dead, taking their secrets with them to the grave. But the photograph they had left behind was beginning to tell a story that federal agents had never been able to piece together. The Kansas City blackout heist was no longer a perfect crime executed by unknown criminals. It was becoming a case with names, faces, and a trail of evidence that stretched across decades. The investigation was far from over, but for the first time in 53 years, federal agents had something concrete to work with. The burnt Polaroid had opened a door that had been sealed since 1971, and behind that door lay answers that would finally solve one of the FBI's most enduring mysteries. The enhanced photograph became the key that unlocked a conspiracy far more sophisticated than investigators had originally imagined. As federal agents dug deeper into the connection between Thomas Mitchell and Robert Chen, they uncovered a network of relationships that had remained hidden for over 5 decades. The two men hadn't just worked together on legitimate power company contracts. They had been planning the Federal Reserve heist for months, using Chen's electronics expertise and Mitchell's insider knowledge to create the perfect storm of opportunity. Chen's immigration records revealed a man with extraordinary technical skills who had fled Taiwan under circumstances that remained unclear. His expertise in electronic systems and security equipment made him invaluable to anyone seeking to circumvent sophisticated alarm systems. Mitchell, meanwhile, had access to detailed information about Kansas City's electrical grid, including the precise timing and duration of planned maintenance outages. The partnership had been born of necessity and mutual benefit. Chen needed someone with intimate knowledge of the power company's operations, while Mitchell needed someone who could provide the technical expertise to exploit that knowledge. Together, they had identified the Federal Reserve Bank's vulnerability during planned blackouts and had spent months preparing for their one perfect opportunity. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, they discovered that Chen had been conducting surveillance of the Federal Reserve Building for nearly 6 months before the heist. Using his legitimate electronics business as cover, he had photographed the building's exterior, studied the guard rotations, and identified the loading dock as the most vulnerable entry point. His technical background allowed him to understand exactly how the building's security systems would be affected by a power outage. Mitchell's role had been equally crucial. He had provided Chen with detailed schedules of planned maintenance, including the exact timing and duration of blackouts across different sectors of the city. More importantly, he had used his position with the power company to ensure that the August 14th blackout would last exactly as long as they needed, with no unexpected complications or early restoration of power. The investigation revealed that the two men had recruited at least 2 additional conspirators, though their identities remained unclear from the available evidence. The service van used in the heist had been stolen by individuals whose descriptions didn't match either Mitchell or Chen, suggesting that they had hired professionals to handle the actual break-in while they maintained plausible alibis. Chen's electronics business had served as the perfect front for the operation. His workshop contained all the equipment necessary to modify security systems, create false identification, and communicate with criminal contacts without attracting attention. The fireproof safe where the photograph had been discovered likely contained other evidence of the conspiracy, documents and materials that had been destroyed in a fire that had damaged the building in the early 1980s. The financial trail that investigators uncovered painted a picture of careful money laundering spread across decades. Mitchell's sudden prosperity in 1972 represented only a fraction of his share of the stolen $2.1 million. The bulk of his proceeds had been invested in legitimate businesses and real estate ventures that had generated clean income for years. His move to Arizona hadn't been motivated by health problems, as he had claimed, but by a desire to distance himself from Kansas City and start fresh with his newfound wealth. Chen had been even more cautious with his share of the money. His electronics business had provided steady, legitimate income that masked any suspicious financial activity. He had made strategic investments in commercial real estate and had gradually converted his criminal proceeds into legal assets. By the time of his death in 2003, he had built a modest fortune that appeared to have been earned entirely through legitimate business activities. The photograph that had exposed the conspiracy appeared to have been taken as insurance, a form of mutual assurance between criminal partners who needed to trust each other with life-changing secrets. The fact that Chen had preserved it in his fireproof safe suggested that he had maintained leverage over Mitchell even after their criminal partnership had ended. Both men had understood that their success depended on permanent silence, and the photograph had ensured that silence would be maintained. Federal agents working the case in 2024 faced the frustrating reality that both primary suspects were beyond the reach of justice. Mitchell had died in 1998, and Chen had passed away in 2003, taking their secrets with them to the grave. The statute of limitations had long since expired, and even if the men had still been alive, prosecuting a case based on a single damaged photograph would have been challenging. Yet the discovery provided closure that had eluded investigators for over 5 decades. The Kansas City Blackout heist was no longer an unsolved mystery that haunted federal agents and challenged their investigative capabilities. It had become a case study in patience, planning, and the power of inside information. Mitchell and Chen had succeeded not because they were criminal masterminds, but because they had identified a specific vulnerability and had been willing to wait for the perfect moment to exploit it. The investigation also revealed how dramatically criminal investigation techniques had evolved since 1971. The digital enhancement technology that had made Mitchell's identification possible simply hadn't existed during the original investigation. The ability to cross-reference databases, analyze financial records, and trace property ownership across multiple states had been limited by the manual record-keeping systems of the era. In many ways, Mitchell and Chen had been fortunate to commit their crime during a time when law enforcement capabilities were constrained by technological limitations. The Federal Reserve Bank itself had learned valuable lessons from the 1971 heist. Security protocols had been completely overhauled in the years following the theft, with redundant alarm systems, improved backup power supplies, and enhanced guard procedures that would have prevented a similar crime. The building's vulnerability during power outages had been eliminated through the installation of independent security systems that operated regardless of external electrical supply. For the families of Mitchell and Chen, the revelation came as a shock that recontextualized decades of memories. Mitchell's widow, still living in Arizona at the age of 86, expressed disbelief when contacted by federal agents. She had known her husband as a quiet, hard-working man who had provided well for his family, but had never displayed any signs of criminal behavior. The suggestion that his comfortable retirement had been funded by stolen federal money challenged everything she thought she knew about their life together. Chen's children, who had inherited his electronics business and real estate holdings, faced the possibility that their father's estate had been built on criminal proceeds. While the statute of limitations protected them from prosecution, the revelation cast a shadow over their father's legacy and raised uncomfortable questions about the source of their inheritance. The burnt Polaroid that had started it all became a symbol of how the past never truly disappears, even when every effort is made to erase it. Hidden in a fireproof safe for over 50 years, the photograph had waited patiently for technology to advance enough to reveal its secrets. It demonstrated that evidence could survive longer than the criminals who created it, outlasting their careful plans and their confident assumptions about permanent escape. In the end, the Kansas City Blackout heist of 1971 stood as a reminder that perfect crimes exist only in the moment they are committed. Time has a way of preserving evidence that criminals believe they have destroyed, and advancing technology eventually provides tools that can unlock mysteries that seemed permanently sealed. Thomas Mitchell and Robert Chen had succeeded in stealing $2.1 million and living comfortable lives with their ill-gotten gains. But they had failed to account for the one witness they couldn't silence, the photograph that would eventually tell their story to a world that had never stopped looking for answers. The FBI's final report on the Kansas City Blackout heist was filed in December 2024, officially closing a case that had remained active for over 5 decades. The document detailed how a single damaged photograph had unraveled a conspiracy that had successfully evaded federal investigators for generations. Though no arrests could be made, and no stolen money could be recovered, the case provided crucial insights into the evolution of criminal investigation techniques and the persistent nature of evidence. The report concluded that Mitchell and Chen had executed their plan with remarkable precision. exploiting a narrow window of vulnerability that would never again exist in the same form. Their success had depended on perfect timing, inside knowledge, and the technological limitations of 1971 law enforcement. They had understood that cash was the ideal target for theft because it became anonymous once it entered circulation, making recovery nearly impossible even with extensive federal resources. The investigation revealed that the stolen $2.1 million had been distributed among at least 4 individuals, with Mitchell and Chen serving as the primary organizers. The additional conspirators had likely been hired professionals who had handled the actual break-in, while the masterminds maintained their alibis. These individuals had never been identified, and their involvement remained speculation based on witness descriptions and logistical analysis. The money itself had long since disappeared into the American economy, its serial numbers diluted among billions of other bills in circulation. Some of it had been spent immediately on lifestyle improvements and investments, while larger amounts had been carefully laundered through legitimate businesses and real estate transactions. By 2024, even if the original bills could somehow be identified, they would have changed hands thousands of times and would be impossible to trace back to their criminal origins. The Federal Reserve Bank had recovered from the theft and had implemented security measures that made similar crimes virtually impossible. The building systems had been completely modernized, with redundant power supplies, independent alarm networks, and protocols that eliminated the vulnerability that Mitchell and Chen had exploited. The institution had also improved its coordination with local utilities, ensuring that planned outages would never again create opportunities for criminal activity. The case had broader implications for law enforcement agencies across the country. It demonstrated how inside information could be weaponized by individuals who appeared to be trustworthy employees, and it highlighted the importance of thorough background investigations for anyone with access to critical infrastructure. The power company had implemented stricter security protocols for employees with knowledge of planned maintenance, recognizing that such information could be valuable to criminal organizations. For the city of Kansas City, the resolution of the case provided a sense of closure that had been missing for decades. The heist had become part of local folklore, a story that older residents told about the night the lights went out and millions of dollars vanished. The discovery of the photograph and the identification of the perpetrators transformed the crime from an unsolved mystery into a completed chapter of the city's history. The warehouse where the photograph had been found was demolished as planned, its concrete and steel recycled for new construction projects. The site would eventually become part of a mixed-use development that would bring new life to the industrial district. The building's role in preserving evidence of the 1971 heist would be remembered only in police reports and federal files, another example of how the past intersects with the present in unexpected ways. The investigation had required the collaboration of multiple agencies, from local police to federal agents to forensic specialists who had worked to enhance the damaged photograph. It demonstrated how cold casework had evolved from the manual filing systems of the 1970s to the digital databases and advanced analytical tools of the 2020s. The case would be studied in law enforcement training programs as an example of how persistence and technological advancement could eventually solve crimes that had seemed permanently closed. The families affected by the revelation continued to process the implications of learning that their loved ones had been involved in federal crimes. Mitchell's widow had chosen to remain in Arizona, declining interview requests and maintaining her privacy as she reconsidered decades of memories. Chen's children had consulted with attorneys about the potential impact on their father's estate, though legal experts had concluded that the statute of limitations protected them from any financial liability. The burnt Polaroid photograph, now preserved in FBI archives, served as a reminder that evidence could survive longer than the criminals who created it. The image had waited patiently in its fireproof safe for over 50 years, protected from destruction by the same security measures that Chen had used to safeguard his other valuable documents. It had outlasted both conspirators and had eventually provided the key to solving one of the most enduring mysteries in federal law enforcement. In the end, the Kansas City Blackout heist represented both the possibilities and limitations of criminal ambition. Mitchell and Chen had succeeded in stealing a fortune and had lived comfortable lives with their proceeds. They had avoided detection, escaped prosecution, and had died believing that their perfect crime would remain forever unsolved. Yet they had failed to account for the persistence of evidence and the relentless advance of investigative technology. The photograph they had created as insurance against each other had ultimately become the evidence that exposed their conspiracy to the world. The case closed not with arrests or convictions, but with the satisfaction of finally understanding what had happened on that humid August night in 1971. The mystery that had frustrated federal agents for generations had been solved by a combination of chance discovery, advanced technology, and the simple fact that some evidence never truly disappears. The lights had come back on in Kansas City 53 years later, illuminating a truth that had been hidden in darkness for half a century.